It was a dark and stormy night when Mark, a food delivery driver, received an order from a remote part of town. The address was unfamiliar, tucked away in a neighborhood he had never been to before. Despite the heavy rain and howling wind, Mark set off to deliver the food, thinking it would be a quick and easy job. As he drove through the deserted streets, the GPS directed him deeper into a part of town that seemed to be forgotten by time. The houses were old and dilapidated, and there were no streetlights to guide his way. The rain made it even harder to see, and the occasional flash of lightning only added to the eerie atmosphere. Mark finally arrived at the address. It was an old, run-down mansion at the end of a long, overgrown driveway. The place looked abandoned, but he could see a faint light flickering in one of the windows. He parked his car and walked up to the front door, the food bag clutched tightly in his hand. He knocked on the door and waited, but there was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, and the door creaked open on its own. The hallway beyond was dimly lit, and the air was filled with the scent of mildew and decay. Hesitant but determined to complete the delivery, Mark stepped inside and called out, asking if anyone was home. There was no response. Mark felt a chill run down his spine, but he pushed forward, telling himself it was just an old house. He walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing off the wooden floors. As he reached the end of the hallway, he noticed a figure standing in the shadows. The figure stepped into the light, revealing an old woman with sunken eyes and a gaunt face. She stared at Mark with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. She told him to leave the food on the table in the next room. Relieved to finally hand over the delivery, Mark quickly complied. As he turned to leave, the old woman asked him to stay for a moment. She said she hadn't had company in years and wanted to offer him a drink. Mark hesitated, but felt it would be rude to decline. She led him into a dimly lit parlor where an old, dusty armchair sat facing a cold fireplace. She handed him a cup of tea and insisted he sit down. Mark took a sip of the tea, trying to ignore the strange taste. The old woman sat across from him and began to talk about her life in the mansion, how she had lived there alone for decades after her family had died. As she spoke, Mark felt a growing sense of unease. The room seemed to grow colder, and he noticed shadows moving out of the corner of his eye. He tried to stay polite, but his fear was mounting. He decided to finish his tea quickly and make an excuse to leave. Just as he was about to stand up, he heard a whisper behind him. He turned around, but there was no one there. The old woman continued to talk, seemingly oblivious to the strange occurrences. Mark felt a hand on his shoulder, cold and clammy, but when he looked, there was nothing there. Panic set in, and Mark stood up abruptly, apologizing and saying he had to leave. The old woman's expression changed, becoming angry and desperate. She pleaded with him to stay, saying she was lonely and needed company. Mark backed away, his heart racing, and hurried out of the room. He ran down the hallway, the shadows seeming to chase him. As he reached the front door, it slammed shut in his face. He tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Mark felt a cold breath on his neck and turned to see the old woman standing right behind him, her eyes filled with rage. She told him he could never leave, that he would stay with her forever. Mark's fear turned to terror, and he fought to open the door. Just as he was about to give up, it flew open, and he stumbled out into the rain. He ran to his car, started the engine, and sped away from the mansion as fast as he could. When he reached home, Mark was shaking and drenched from the rain. He told his roommate about the terrifying experience, but they thought he was just tired and imagining things. Mark knew what he had seen and felt, and he vowed never to go back to that part of town again. A few days later, out of curiosity, Mark looked up the address of the mansion. He discovered that the house had been abandoned for years after the last owner, an old woman, had died alone. Rumor had it that her spirit still haunted the mansion, searching for someone to keep her company. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he had narrowly escaped becoming her next victim. The experience left him scared, and he quit his job as a delivery driver soon after. The memory of that night haunted him, a constant reminder of the things that lurk in the shadows, waiting to ensnare the unsuspecting. This next story is just as chilling, if not more. Imagine being a food delivery driver working the night shift. This was the case for Lisa, a young woman who took on the job to make some extra money. One night, she received an order from a house located on the outskirts of town. It was a large order, unusual for the late hour, but Lisa didn't think much of it and set off to deliver the food. The road to the address was long and winding, leading her through a dense forest. The further she drove, the more isolated she felt. Her car's headlights barely penetrated the darkness, and the trees seemed to close in around her. Finally, she reached the house, a large old mansion that stood alone in a clearing. The mansion looked neglected, with ivy crawling up the walls and windows darkened by grime. Lisa felt a pang of unease but brushed it off. She grabbed the food and walked up to the front door, knocking loudly. There was no answer at first, but then she heard faint footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, and a middle-aged man with a stern expression peered out. He looked at Lisa with cold, piercing eyes and told her to come inside. Despite her apprehension, Lisa stepped into the dimly lit foyer, feeling the temperature drop as she entered. The man instructed her to follow him to the dining room, where he said the rest of the family was waiting. As Lisa walked through the house, she noticed the walls were lined with old portraits, their eyes seeming to follow her every move. The atmosphere was heavy, and an unsettling silence filled the air. When they reached the dining room, Lisa was taken aback. The table was set for a large number of people, but the chairs were empty. The man gestured for her to place the food on the table and then stood back, watching her intently. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine as she arranged the food, the man's gaze never leaving her. Just as she finished, she heard whispers coming from the shadows. She looked around but saw no one. The whispers grew louder, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. Lisa turned to the man, asking if he needed anything else. He shook his head and told her she could leave. Relieved, Lisa hurried back to the foyer, but as she reached the door, she realized it was locked. Panic set in as she struggled to open it. The man appeared behind her, his expression unchanged, and told her she needed to meet the rest of the family before she could leave. He led her down a dark hallway to a door at the end. Lisa's heart pounded as he opened it, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the basement. The whispers grew louder, and she hesitated, but the man insisted she follow him. They descended into the basement, the air growing colder with each step. When they reached the bottom, Lisa saw a group of people standing in the shadows. As she stepped closer, she realized with horror that they weren't alive. Their eyes were vacant, their skin pale and lifeless. The man introduced them as his family and said they had been waiting for her. Lisa felt a wave of terror as the whispers turned into chants, and the air grew thick with a sense of malevolence. She tried to back away, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the basement. The man explained that they needed a new member for their family, someone to join them in their eternal existence. He reached out to grab her, but Lisa fought back, breaking free and running up the stairs. She could hear the dead family members shuffling behind her, their chants growing louder. She reached the top of the stairs and threw herself against the door, desperate to escape. It finally gave way, and she ran through the house, the cold hands of the dead brushing against her as she passed. She reached the front door, unlocked it, and burst out into the night. Lisa ran to her car, started the engine, and sped away, her heart racing. She didn't stop until she reached the town, where she pulled over and broke down in tears. She knew she had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. The next day, Lisa reported the house to the police, but when they investigated, they found it abandoned and in ruins. There was no sign of the man or his family. The only evidence of Lisa's visit was the food she had delivered, still sitting on the table, untouched. Lisa quit her job as a delivery driver and never spoke of the incident again. The experience left her traumatized, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurk in the shadows, waiting to claim their next victim. The memory of that night haunted her, a chilling tale of a midnight delivery gone terribly wrong. Months later, Lisa was still trying to piece her life back together. She had moved to a new town, hoping to leave the past behind. One evening, while she was home alone, the phone rang. She hesitated before answering, but curiosity got the better of her. A familiar cold voice greeted her. It was the man from the mansion. He told her they had found her and that she couldn't escape them. Panic surged through Lisa. She hung up the phone and immediately called the police, but they could do little with such vague information. Determined to confront her fear once more, Lisa decided to return to the mansion. She couldn't live in constant terror, and she needed to find a way to put an end to the nightmare. She armed herself with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, hoping it would be enough to protect her. As she drove back to the mansion, the sky grew darker and a storm began to brew. The road seemed even more menacing than before, but Lisa pressed on. She arrived at the mansion, the wind howling through the trees and the rain pounding down. Lisa took a deep breath and walked up to the front door. It creaked open just as it had before, and she stepped inside, calling out to the man. The house was silent, the only sound her footsteps echoing off the walls. She made her way to the basement door, her heart pounding in her chest. Descending the stairs, Lisa felt the cold air envelop her once again. She reached the basement and saw the figures of the dead family members standing in the shadows. The man stepped forward, his eyes cold and piercing. He told her that she belonged to them now, that she couldn't escape her fate. Lisa gripped the knife tightly, her fear turning into determination. She shouted at the man, demanding to know why they had chosen her. He explained that they needed a living soul to sustain their existence, and she had been the one to deliver it. Lisa refused to accept her fate. She swung the knife at the man, but it passed through him as if he were made of air. The dead family members began to close in on her, their vacant eyes locked onto her. She felt their cold hands grabbing her, pulling her into their darkness. In a desperate act, Lisa remembered the lighter she carried in her pocket. She pulled it out and flicked it on, the small flame flickering in the cold air. She held it up, hoping it would drive them back. The dead recoiled, hissing and retreating into the shadows. Seizing the opportunity, Lisa ran up the stairs and out of the house. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. She sped away from the mansion, not daring to look back. As she drove, she realized she had to destroy the house to break the curse. The next day, Lisa gathered supplies and returned to the mansion one last time. She poured gasoline around the perimeter and set it ablaze. The flames quickly consumed the old wood, and the house began to collapse. She stood there, watching the fire burn, feeling a sense of relief as the structure was reduced to ashes. Lisa hoped that the fire would finally put an end to the nightmare. She returned home, feeling lighter but still cautious. The memories of that night would never fully leave her, but she had faced her fear and fought back. The mansion and its horrors were gone, but the experience had changed her forever. From that day on, Lisa dedicated herself to helping others avoid similar fates. She shared her story, warning people about the dangers that lurk in the shadows. She knew that the world was full of hidden terrors, but she also knew that courage and determination could overcome them. The memory of the midnight delivery remained a dark chapter in her life, but it also became a testament to her strength and resilience.